to Arcast, the official podcast of the Archain Cooperative. Archain is a complete concurrent blockchain platform designed for maximum efficiency at minimal computational and environmental costs by utilizing proof of stake. I'm Derek Barris, the Director of Content for Archain. We cover a range of topics on this podcast, from the foundations of blockchain in general to the specifics of Archain, including our foundational language, Rolang, as well as issues in calculus, governance, security, and the forthcoming businesses and dApp development on our platform. Please check out archain.coop to learn more about our platform, as well as information on becoming a co-op member.
As always, thank you to Derek for hosting. I really appreciate it. And thank you to Isaac for taking the time out of your schedule and joining us on this call. I want to talk today about a very odd idea. It will strike many people as strange. Hopefully I can give some motivations for the idea and then move on to greater and greater levels of technical depth. The idea is that currency, capital, money, however we phrase it, if you were to think about it like in terms of programming concepts, in terms of the computation, money is untyped. Money has a very specific property, which is its biggest strength in terms of its adoption. And really, if you go back to the origins of the use of capital, this property of money was sort of why it was adopted in the first place. And that is that you can convert money into anything and anything into money. That's the idea. So it's a lot more efficient to trade cowrie shells at the market and then later deliver bales of hay or barrels of fish or kegs of ale than it is to lug all that stuff to the trading depot. And then if things don't go exactly as planned, then have to lug a whole bunch of it back and possibly some of it spoiling and all of that. There's an efficiency that's gained by just doing the exchanges symbolically. And then later sort of mapping that exchange onto delivery of goods and services. That efficiency has extended into electronic markets and internet-based markets. But it ends up having consequences that we see every day, but because we all were born in, anyone that's hearing this podcast was born in an era post-money. And so it's hard to imagine how it might be different. If we come at it from the angle of computing or computation, things get a little clearer. This ability to convert anything into money and money back into anything corresponds to being able to set a price for something. There's this old adage that, everything and everyone has their price. That refers to this property of money that we can set a price for something. And because we can set a price for something, then we can literally, miraculously change water into wine. We have a price for water, and then we have a price for wine. That's sort of that's the the essence of this property. If we are C or C++ programmers, then the entity that corresponds to is void star at the type level. If I have a pointer to any kind of data type, I can always cast it to void star, which is now a pointer to something where I have no type information. And then in languages like C and C++, that's called upcasting, right? So I'm throwing away type information, which means I'm going up towards the top of the type hierarchy, meaning I have less and less information. When I go down further in the type hierarchy, I gain information. So if I cast a void star and then I do some manipulations, for example, I might serialize the data and ship it across the wire and then deserialize it. And now I would want to figure out what kind of thing this is. And so downcasting it is asserting that this thing that was void star is something like a pointer to an integer or a pointer to some struct that contains information, let's say about a shipment of apples or a shipment of oranges. That kind of downcasting is not safe because since we lost all the type information, we don't know if it really is the thing that we are asserting that it is without some out of band check. In a language like JavaScript, this is equivalent to saying that what I've got is an object. So that's taking it all the way to the root of the type hierarchy. In Java, it's similar. It's like it's saying this thing that I've got, I forget all my type information and turn it into objects. So it's at the root of the type hierarchy. Once I've lost that information, once I've forgotten that information, recovering that information has to have come out of band. And therein lies the rub. Things may go south in that. And providing the information out of band is basically just saying, I'm going to carry along the type information along some secondary channel. So that's a lot to digest, but let me just stop there and check in with you, Isaac, and see if that makes some sense.
Yeah, definitely. I really like this analogy of money or currency, I guess, and how it's similar to this notion of typecasting and just information about a type. And essentially that just corresponds to like, what can you use the currency for, which essentially, like you said at the beginning, is just about anything. This is a really cool idea.
Cool. I'm glad it's resonating. It's one of these greatest strengths, greatest weaknesses trade-offs, right? So the money's greatest strength is that we can convert. It allows us to convert anything into anything, or anything for which we can set a price. That can be converted into anything. The trade-off is that there is no objective valuation, right? So there's no yardstick that we can all agree on that will allow us to have objective adjudication on valuation. We see this happen all the time, right? Because of this property of money, the board can value the CEO's behavior one way, while the shareholders value the CEO's behavior a different way, and there's no objective adjudication.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to take it to the courts. It had become some kind of social adjudication, but nothing that's objective.
Census almost.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And if you go over to the programming world, like you follow the analogy over into that world, we know the problem. The problem is a lack of type safety. Mm-hmm. And wherever you have a lack of type safety, you can then run into these, this thing is not what you think it is, errors. Mm-hmm. You thought it was water, but it's actually wine.
I'd be okay with that.
Well, not if you're the designated driver, right?
Yeah.
That's right. That ends up being a source of a lot of errors, runtime errors in programs in C, C++, JavaScript, these kinds of things where you don't have type safety. Even in Haskell, where it's a strongly typed language, there are places where you can do sort of untyped safe magic. Life gets miserable. The trade-off is a serious one. The question is, could we add type safety to currency? Could we make a notion of typed currency? I want to just point out that in the blockchain world, it's kind of the wild, wild west, right? So we're exploring all kinds of different financial instruments because there's so much plasticity. Now that we can program currency, people are beginning to remember that currency wasn't this God-given thing. It was an invention by humans. We can explore what roles it was designed to serve. Is there a different way to configure or reorganize things so it could serve those roles better, or maybe identify new roles and that kind of thing? And so that's one of the most wonderful things about blockchain. I mean, I remember I think it was 2015, I was sitting on a tube with Vlad and another blockchain researcher, and they were just really going at it in terms of design of financial instruments to achieve certain effects. And I was just really struck by how, with blockchain, the kids could, make the design of financial instruments and the gamification of human behavior something that is second nature, right? And in the same way that most of us, it's second nature to be able to manage a bank account. Well, at least for some of us. This next level behavior of being able to design currencies and design financial instruments that gamify certain behaviors would be just like second nature. They could just, oh, we've been doing this all our lives, right? And it's like kids today who have never known a time before the internet. Second nature to just whip out your phone and use Google or Google Maps or any of hundreds of other services that are a part of the fabric of daily life. I think this is a really beautiful opportunity to suggest some things we might have missed about currency, and in particular, like what would a typed currency look like?
Mm-hmm.
And I want to point out that the biggest difference between typeless currency and a typed currency would be the ability to constrain or restrict what the currency can be exchanged for.
Yeah, that totally makes sense.
So the interesting thing here is that there are markets where that's the name of the game. So foreign exchange, right? Foreign exchange instruments are double-ended at a minimum. It's all about, I can do dollars for yen, or I can do euros for lira. I don't know. The point is that these things come in pairs, and so it's natural to talk about certain kinds of restrictions.
Yeah,
it's not a far-fetched idea. Is all I'm trying to get at. That even in today's markets, we understand certain kinds of instruments as being about that sort of enforcement that you can only convert this into that. So the general purpose thing that we're trying to do does show up in everyday examples. So it's not as far-fetched. The other thing that I want to point out is that we could kind of have our cake and eat it too, in the sense that we could ask, is there some kind of minimal model that we could build up of typed currency, sort of from first principles, and yet still stick with this idea that there's only one kind of thing that could be exchanged. If we're going to go into transactional mode, then whenever we're in that mode, there's only one thing that can be used for transmission. We go down to the market, and if we're not armed with this thing, whether it's cowrie shells or Quatlus or Bitcoin or whatever it is, if we don't have that thing, then we can't conduct transactions. Intriguingly, this is exactly the proposition of the Rowe calculus. What the Rowe calculus says is, if we're going to do a transaction, which is a COM event, there's only one thing that gets exchanged, and that's code.
Right.
And I want to point out that the same is true of the pi calculus. There's only one thing that can be exchanged, and that's a name. But what the pi calculus doesn't do is connect names to processes.
Right.
It turns out that you can make that connection. In particular, Davide Sangiorgi showed that there's a calculus called the higher order pi calculus, in which you can also ship processes around. And then he shows that you can fully and faithfully translate his higher order pi calculus down to the ordinary pi calculus. It's always possible to connect names to behaviors, but in the Rowe calculus, this is direct. The direct connection allows us to constrain what we can trade for what, essentially. I want to point out that I saw this aspect of currency in 1999, looking at it from the perspective of the pi calculus. And then in 2002, I saw the Rowe calculus. And then I sort of connected the dots more later. But, it was like in 1999, I looked at this and I thought, oh my God, if I were to talk about this in public, the economists will beat me up. You don't know anything about economics or trading behavior or anything, and the computer scientists will beat me up. What are you trying to do? You know? And I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to be quiet about this, even though I do think it's a foundational idea and brings into question a lot of what we think about currency. In some sense, the row calculus is made for this idea. That's why I gave this historical information. But the next point really connects it to Ladle and the namespace logic. The point there is, if we just start with a little bit of background. So it was around 2002, 2003 that Kyrase and Cardelli were starting to look at the spatial logics. From their point of view, the spatial logics gave one visibility into the structure of programs. Right? So you could have formulae that could detect whether or not a process was composed of two parallel processes.
Right.
That's kind of important because there's a famous theorem, probably the most important, or one of the most important theorems in the relationship between bisimulation and the Hennessy-Milner logics. The spatial behavioral logics are a refinement of the Hennessy-Milner logics for people who don't know that background. The Hennessy-Milner logics are a form of modal logics. In addition to true and false and negation and conjunction and fixed point operators, things like that, you also have the ability to talk about the evolution of a program.
Right.
So in the case of the pi calculus or the row calculus, evolution only happens via COM events. So you can ask whether a particular input-output event is possible or whether it's necessary. Possible would say that there's at least one, the process could do a COM event. It is one of the things that it could do is this COM event, either by doing an output or by doing an input. And necessary is like, no matter which path you take out of this state, no matter what this process does, it must do this IO event to go forward, to make progress.
Right.
So that's the Hennessy-Milner logics, and they have this property that two processes are bisimilar, which is the notion of equivalence in process calculus. If and only if, for any formula in Hennessy-Milner logic, let's say we're talking about processes P and Q, then P is bisimilar to Q if and only if for every formula, let's call it phi, P satisfies phi or models phi exactly when Q models phi.
Yeah.
This is a beautiful theorem, right? Because what it says is the Hennessy-Milner logics crisply characterize bisimulation or bisimilarity.
Yeah, they the formulae separate non-bisimilar processes, I guess.
That's exactly right. And in fact, you could do all kinds of crazy, weird, fun things. Like let's say we had a well ordering of the Hennessy-Milner formulae. Then you could come up with a distance between processes by just going down the list, this ordered list of all the formulae, until you get to the first one where they differ. And that distance, the length of that prefix of this infinite list is how far apart they are.
Yeah, interesting.
So there's all kinds of fun, crazy stuff you can do with this information, and that might be the subject of other RCAST. But the spatial logics add structural information. It is important to understand that bisimulation cannot, for all interleaving semantics of the pi calculus or the row calculus, bisimulation cannot distinguish between concurrency and interleaving. So that means that every parallel composition can be turned into a giant sum, a giant choice,
Right.
which is all the different possible interleavings of all the IO actions.
Right. Right.
That's kind of interesting because it means that with the Hennessy-Milner logics, you couldn't detect whether a process did this by just summing up all the interleavings or put a par in there.
Mm-hmm.
And the important thing about par is exactly this expressiveness. You replace this giant sum of all the interleavings, which is exponentially explosive, right, with one symbol. Right.
Yeah.
So P vertical bar Q, covers that giant sum of all the interleavings. That's part of the expressiveness of the process calculi. They overcome this exponential explosion, which is why they are so superior to state machines. State machine, and I know this from hard-won experience. Trying to do modeling of concurrent systems in which you've only got state machines. The interleaving stuff causes this exponential growth, which brings your simulator to its knees. Whereas with the par, you can do algebraic manipulations. And as long as you stay up at the level of the algebra, you don't have to unfold all those interleavings. You can do that in a lazy fashion. And as a result, you can cover a lot more ground in terms of the computation. And that, in many ways, is the essence of the power of Erlang, is precisely that.
Oh, that's cool.
So, yeah, so there's lots of stuff that's hiding in what we do that we don't ever get a chance to talk about, but that is pretty awesome. Back to the story. I'll bring this back to typed currency in just a second, but I had to provide a little bit of background. So the spatial logics they have X-ray vision. They can see that you've got a par.
Mm-hmm.
Which breaks this by simulation characterization theorem. Now, it turns out that if you add as a special class of observations, so all the IO events are effectively, observations that you can make. If you add an extra class of observations that correspond to the equational characterization of par, like the fact that it's a commutative monoid and that sort of thing, you can recover this theorem.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to see that you've done an association, being able to see that you've done a commutation, all of those things recover the observations you need in order to regain the correspondence between formulae and by simulation. And so this correspondence is preserved, and this is really, it turns out to be really important because to date, all process equivalences factor through by simulation.
Do you have a reference for the result that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can put it in a link. So what that means is if you study by simulation, that's all you ever need to study.
Yeah.
For someone like me with a tiny little brain, like knowing I can jettison like this giant, vast, sea of concepts around equivalences of concurrent computation, and just focus on this one thing, and everything else is just a specialization of that one thing. That's a huge win. I can declutter my brain. But because we have this X-ray vision into the structure of processes, in the background of all of this, I'm implicitly invoking Curry-Howard. So whenever I say formulae, I'm also saying types. If I come up with a formula system for the behaviors, right? So in Kairos' world, that doesn't say much about the structure of the names that are being communicated because they're unrelated. There's no relationship between names in the pi calculus and the behaviors of pi calculus processes. But in the row calculus, we have a very different story.
Yeah.
Right?
They're very intimately connected with the processes.
Exactly. Yeah. So now let's talk about some fun things we can do, right? As soon as I have a type system for the behaviors, I already have a type system for the names. Right? So now let's imagine that I don't allow the dereference. So I can use negation as a means of excluding dereference, or I can do it, and I can do it in a number, either constructively or via negate classically. That's more detailed than we need. We just simply, if we use the types to restrict the use of dereference, right, where I'm turning a name back into a process. Dereference is the only way new names can be constructed. So that's provable in the row calculus. Essentially, dereferences functions in the same way that backquote does in Lisp, or the comma, the prefixed comma does in a Lisp-based or scheme-based macro system, splicing into your quoted expression some evaluated expression. And that is the only mechanism that allows you to construct new names. So that means that if I wanted to have, let's say, a fixed supply of names, in other words, a fixed supply of currency, by putting in this restriction, no dereference, then what I'm saying is you can't ever pass me a behavior that is a mint. Right. So I'm not allowing for mints to be instantiated.
Right.
With just the minimal amount. Like we did this long detour through some of the theory, but in terms of the system that's in front of us, the row calculus, with just one idea, we've already been able to talk about controlling the supply of the currency.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and so we can also do things like, we can insist the available currency diminish. We can insist that there's a balancing in the currency. If we start thinking about the types for currency as namespaces, we can say that, well, I've got names coming from the red namespace and names coming from the blue namespace. And we can insist that if you start a transaction with the red namespace, you're going to close it with the blue namespace. So you can get all kinds of balanced paren style behaviors around the use of currency, which allows you to do foreign exchange kinds of instrumentation at the type level. So you could prove that at the end, in a community, you've got a distribution of currency that, you start with a particular distribution of currency, and at the end, if you're not minting anything, you end up with a different distribution of currency. It's just like balancing chemical equations, right? You don't ever get to create any elements, right? You're always just shuffling the packaging of the elements, right? So like, in the example of the formation of salt, you're not creating any sodium, you're not creating any chlorine. They get to combine or be packaged together into NaCl to get you the salt. And so all of that kind of behavior, which is just about packaging and distribution of currency, can be crisply characterized with the namespaces. To my mind, this is absolutely worthy of investigation. Part of my motivation for bringing it up at this point is to reach out, now that RChain is nearing mainnet, reach out to the community of youngsters out there and say, hey, there's a whole bunch of toys here that nobody's ever thought about. And if we're thinking about currency as one of our coordination technologies, this is going to give you a toolbox for gamifying behavior like we've never seen before. I'm reading a series of books by Yuval Noah Harari. The first one is Sapiens, and then there's a Homo Deus, and then there's I think 21 lessons for the 22nd century or something like that. I can't remember the third one. He just makes over and over again the point that what differentiates Homo sapiens from other species, their superpower is coordination. I just continue to feel that we have to enhance or lift that superpower up to level it up, so to speak, to address what's going on with climate change. I feel like, astonishingly fortuitous that just at the time when we need to level up, there's this crazy toolbox for coordination that just opened up.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, that's pretty weird.
Yeah, it kind of almost smells a little bit like destiny.
I mean, I don't, I mean, typically, you find the things you need right at the moment you need them, right? Necessity is the
That's
mother of
true.
invention, right? Because your mind is focused. Oh my God, I really need this thing now.
Right.
I just feel like this is an incredibly rich toolbox. And the other thing is, art is long, life is short. I've been able to carry the idea this far forward, and I'm sure that if I keep playing with it, I can keep coming up with more and more interesting instruments and examples. I'm just really inspired by what Vlad and that blockchain researcher were doing, where they had gone so much further into this understanding of the gamification of human behavior using financial instruments. I would love to see someone who had an interest in mechanism design, which is typically what the term of art there. If they could have this toolbox, what would they do? What could they do? Any thoughts from your side? Is this making sense?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you're talking about an ability to essentially constrain what your money can be used for. I mean, that's like such a generic concept that it seems like you could do just about anything with it. Yeah, so I would be incredibly interested to see what someone would do with this kind of idea.
Yeah, I agree. And the one thing, just to circle back to a point that we mentioned at the top, it means that you can walk the structure of your financial behavior, your transactional behavior, and adjudicate valuations. It's algorithmic how you get to a notion of valuation. It's no longer a question of social consensus.
Right.
Once you have these disciplines, they come along with yardsticks. I mean, there's no magic. There's no anti-gravity machine. We're not pulling a rabbit out of a hat here. The place where the complexity shifts away from the social consensus around evaluation, it moves into the social consensus around the design of the transactional behavior itself.
Right.
If everyone buys into the rules of the game, so to speak, then the valuation becomes objective.
Yeah, that's so interesting because that just is, reminds me of the analogy of blockchain in general, because that's essentially what you're doing. It's like no longer just trusting that people are going to do as they say. And it's like now we have everything, in code that we can execute and verify and make sure that it will run the way we expect it to.
Yes, that's exactly right. I'll be honest, I probably shouldn't say this in public, but I would go to these Ethereum conferences and people would be saying, well, now we can just look at the code and see that it does this, that, or the other. And I would just be cringing because no, that isn't true.
Yeah.
The halting, it is halting hard to determine whether or not a particular subroutine will be called. Unless you have something else, that isn't going to happen. And we saw this with code audits, right? The DAO was audited, and yet it had all kinds of exploits inside it. So just looking at code is not sufficient. On the flip side, people have long thought, okay, well, that's the end, therefore, of any sort of verification or anything. No, that's not true. There are two dials. There's the expressivity of your language, and there's the expressivity of the properties. And there's a sweet spot where you have interesting levels of expressivity in the language and interesting levels of expressivity in the properties that you can verify of those programs. And that covers a huge range of behavior that is transactional. And where the rubber meets the road, if people really want to see this in math, in Kyrus's spatial behavioral properties in a logic for the pi calculus. He identifies a class of formulae for the pi calculus where the model check is terminated. And it's a non-trivial class of formulae, but you can shuffle it around. You can increase the power of the formulae as long as you correspondingly decrease the power of your processes, the kinds of processes you can write down, which is basically just constraining your scripting language down to something that's more tractable if you want to have more interesting formulae. So that makes practical the intuition that these people at Ethereum conferences were espousing. The way they were thinking about getting there just by human eyeball inspection is never going to happen. But the spirit of what they were searching for, that is absolutely possible, and it's possible with the use of typing information. If we're using these things to design financial instruments and other aspects of digital currency, this is the way to go, or at least to date, this appears to be the most effective and most mathematically tractable way to go about that program.